Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today we're going to teach everybody how to resist. This is a time when governments are giving a lot of people a very hard time, and it's time for us to think about the various methods in which different people in different periods of time have attempted and sometimes successfully managed to resist or even overthrow their own governments and get a regime change. But I don't know whether we want to plan for that today. But the question is, how can you fight back? And I have three experts here who know and who almost professionally, I would say, are engaged in thinking about and teaching people how to resist. And they are, in the order in which they appear on my screen, Jill Carr-Harris, who is living here in Canada for the summer and working very closely with me. But normally, most of the time, she spends her time in India, where she works with an organization called Ekta Parishad, which was founded by her husband, Rajagopal, and they are quite a good, wonderful team in running. I think they have 3 ashrams in different parts of India where they do constructive work and development work, but a lot of peace work. In Sweden, in a place called Sparnash, Sweden, which is a little village, I understand. Is that right? Jorgen Johansson, who is, he was, we were just reminiscing about when we saw each other last. It must have been a good 20 years ago. But Jorgen Johansson has been the he is the deputy editor of the Journal of Resistance Studies. And he's also with something called the Nordic Nonviolence Study Group. And he sometimes teaches at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Have I got that right, Jorgen? Or do you need to correct me?
Almost. I've been doing quite a lot of different things during the last 50 years.
Yeah, okay. Very good. And he's not in San Francisco at the moment. I thought he was. Stephen Zunis says he's in Michigan. But normally he teaches at the University of San Francisco. And he's been there a number of years, 20 years or so, or more, teaching courses especially on the politics of the Middle East. But he also teaches courses on nonviolent resistance. So we've got 3 people here who have different, angles or how to go about. By the way, Stephen, yesterday I should have had you present because we did a talk show on the Middle East, and we got some people together who did not think alike whatsoever. So there were fireworks, and it was all very interesting, but I hadn't planned it to work out that way. Anyway, next time I'll get to you for commenting on the Middle East also. Okay, Jorgen, why don't you start off telling us?
Well, for the last few years, I've been mainly publishing books in a small publishing house and doing lecturings and seminars here out in the forest in Scandinavia. I've been traveling too much early in my life. I've been traveling in 120 countries around the world, so I'm quite tired of traveling, and I sometimes blame myself for being the main reason for the global warming because of all my flights. So now I stopped flying, and I want to spend more time home with my wife, and we are inviting people here to do some writing and seminars and trying to do some training in nonviolence and resistance.
And Stephen, I think you said you had stayed at his place. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was a visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg last year, and had an excellent time. I was there in the sociology department, which has a very strong center in social movements, which Jürgen Stellan Windhagen and a lot of other folks have had affiliations with over the years. And I would, but I loved escaping up to the countryside to see Jürgen's community. My main areas in terms of my research is U.S. Middle East policy. But I've also had a long-standing interest in strategic nonviolent action, both as an activist in my earlier days, but also as a chronicler of struggles where even in very authoritarian situations, people were able to rise up and bring down their governments through massive non-cooperation. And I've published works on Indonesia and Kenya and Bolivia and South Korea and Serbia and Ukraine and Egypt and Bahrain and South Africa and quite a number of other places as well. What's been kind of interesting of late is that many of these were published in some rather obscure academic journals, but suddenly I'm noticing they're getting all these hits. And I think it's because people are really wanting to know, especially here in the United States nowadays, how does one rise up against authoritarianism? Indeed, one of the papers was about when you have these kind of administrative coups, where democratically elected governments end up taking on authoritarian powers and ways to resist that, and that's certainly relevant here in the United States and a number of other countries as well.
Actually, I was surprised because every now and then I read something that David Brooks of the New York Times publishes, and he has been promoting nonviolent resistance. Go to the streets, do something.
It's quite remarkable because Brooks is actually quite conservative on almost any measure, but he was quoting Gene Sharp and Erica Chenoweth and other scholars on this, as well as some more liberal columnists like Hintoff and others. I mean, I think there is there is a real desire that in these kind of situations, we can't rely on opposition parties and elected officials alone. It really has to, the real resistance has to come from below.
I believe that one of the people who's kind of a not an organizer, but an influential person that everybody goes to now is Erica Chenoweth. Mm-hmm. And I tried to send her an email and got one of those routine answers saying, I don't have time to answer you. I'm sorry. And I don't blame her because she's doing it. Do you know about the various things that are going on in the U.S.? And by the way, Jorgen reminded me at the beginning that we mustn't just focus on the U.S. because all of these such campaigns are necessary in all parts of the world. But I can't help focusing to some extent on Trump and his malevolence and what we can do about that. So maybe we could have some image about what is going on in the U.S., if anything, and I think there is stuff going on that I don't hear about.
There's a lot of things going on all over the U.S. against different policies by Trump and his administration. More people than ever, I think, are out on the streets. What worries me a little is that they're very good intentions, but some of them are lacking strategies and skills. Mm-hmm. And it's not enough with good intentions. You need to be well prepared. Just like a soldier who goes for training camps for maybe a year before they're sent out on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. I don't think I can't see any reason why nonviolent activists would need less preparation and training than a military soldier. And that's lacking all over the world today.
Well, you do that kind of training yourself. In fact, all of you are nonviolence trainers. And so why don't we do a little comparison of what you do and what you think might be put forward in such a training now?
Well, in most cases, people need to know the history of nonviolent campaigns. And that takes some time to learn what went on. Not all of it is very well documented. And those few documentations we have are mainly on the successful parts of the campaigns. I'm very interested in documenting what went wrong sometimes, because we haven't always been successful. And I think you could learn maybe even more from the mistakes we have done. And that's not documented. People don't know about it. I see the next generation starting from scratch today and doing the same mistakes I did when I was 15 or 20 years old. And that's very sad to see. So I'm very often eager to tell people, please document everything you're doing and do serious, honest evaluations. How did it went? And what could be done better next time? And then we could do more practical training, but that would depend on the context. If it's done in Indonesia, or in Peru, or in Cameroon, or in US, or in Oslo, you need to be very specific on the context and the political system you're working within. And part of that is lacking in these new movements. I'm very happy to see hundreds of thousands on the streets, but they need a little more to be more effective than just good intentions.
One of the things that we do in Ekteperishad is we talk about prepared movements. So when we've taken out big actions like 25,000 people marched from Gwalior to Delhi in 2007, we spent about 4 years training people for that action because they're mainly landless poor. And so marginalized people. So it required setting up about 2,000 trainers or leaders in those areas to help work with the 25,000 people that did march for 1 month to take that action. When we did 100,000 people in 2012, we had to triple the number of people who worked for several years to train people up. So our philosophy has always been, our orientation and direction has always been that we need to prepare the ground. And we went so far as getting every person to put 1 handful of rice and 1 rupee into a mud pot in rural villages so that they could take that money and split it for the family that they left behind and take the other half on the march itself. And so
1 rupee per day and 1 handful of rice per day?
that's correct. And they would do that for 3 years because when you have only 1 rupee a day, it takes time. So I think those kinds of strategies we've tried to bring to Canada, bring to Europe, bring to the US in discussions for many, many years. But I don't think people are really listening until now. I think until more recently, rather. And yesterday I was on a discussion talking about unarmed civil defense against the US in Canada. And, so I think there is really a churning, which I have not seen before in my back and forth. And I think it's now time, I totally agree with Jorgen. It's the time to really do training, understand strategies. I remember in 2008, I wrote a thesis on a case study on being inside a movement for 1 month and what all the strategies were and how the people within the movement acted, but also how they were inspired by people looking at them from outside the movement. So it was almost a sort of cross-sectional analysis of what it's like, what tactics are used in this case, a 1-month campaign. And I agree again with Jorgen that the documentation of those things is really helpful.
That's very important work you're doing, and please try to disseminate that to the rest of the world, because in most part of Western Europe and North America, you could hardly get people to gather for the weekend to prepare for an action.
We think about how militaries around the world, they train their soldiers, for months and months before sending them into combat. And why those of us in nonviolent struggle shouldn't insist on the same kind of discipline, because being right is not enough. You need to think strategically. You need to know what tactics to use, how to sequence those tactics, and understand your strengths and weaknesses, understand the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. You got to think strategically. And what we hear sometimes is, we had all these demonstrations and they didn't work, or we tried demonstrations and they shot into a crowd and killed people. That shows nonviolence doesn't work, or whatever. But come on, if you're a guerrilla army and all you do is attack a fortified sight of the enemy, the same way, day after day, week after week, you're not going to win. No guerrilla army can start off with a frontal assault on the capital. A guerrilla army, starts small, building cadres in the rural areas, does hit and run attacks, kind of builds up to a point where at some point maybe they can make a full frontal assault on the capital. But that's the thing. We often, when we see the downfall of dictators, you see, 1 million people in the streets and the dictator flees in the night. But this, if you look at the movements in Egypt and Serbia and all these other places, they were going on for years, and they started off small, and they grew gradually. And it's not just when the media comes in. It's when a movement doesn't start when the media comes in. A movement starts long beforehand. And so I think you need to understand this protracted struggle. Also, it's not necessarily a situation where you do have 1 million people in the streets and the dictator flees in the night. Sometimes, and I've documented this in countries like Brazil and Kenya and South Korea, and, Taiwan, and some Guyana, and a number of other places, where the institutional and the legal and the constitutional changes take place over a few years, and like the movement will kind of bring things forward and get a slight opening in the system. You try to fill that in and push it out a little more, and sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think of Kenya, the Daniel Arap Moi, the dictator there. He was able to win 2 elections because after he finally allowed free elections and pressure. I mean, he won anyway because the opposition was divided, and yet by the time, but he was no longer a dictator, because the movement had opened up enough political freedoms and political spaces that even though he was still the president, and people could mobilize against his policies. They had people in parliament on their side. They could legally protest. They could organize and things and the like. And I hear people say, "Oh, well, that's just kind of bourgeois reform democracy. That's not the revolutionary changes that we need." But if you ask people in Latin America, when they brought down the dictators there, like in the 1980s, for years things were pretty bad because you may have had democracy, but you had these structural adjustment programs from the IMF and everything, and people were really suffering. But the very fact that unions and peasant leagues and student organizations and women's groups and the progressive church and the other people could organize without the fear of the secret police coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning and hauling them away, enabled the election of a whole series of socialist leaders who really have created some important structural changes in many of these countries. And so, I think we need to remind people, that it's not always a straight line, that it's very often a protracted struggle. But you need to think. You need to think tactically. You need to think strategically. You need to train people. You need, like any other struggle, you need to have the discipline. It's not a simple process.
I completely agree, Stephen. And for the last 5 years, I've been trying to add a new element to the resistance movement, what I've been calling the constructive resistance, inspired from Gandhi, of course. We published this book a few years ago. Do you see it?
No, it's out of focus. Back it up a little.
It's called a constructive resistance.
Show us. You need to hold it away from the camera. Pull it back.
There you go.
Constructivist resistance, yeah.
Keep talking.
Yeah. So this is an example of not only confronting the bad part of society, but start building the new society.
Sure.
Society you would like to see in the future, in small circles, in your neighborhood, in your village, building how you would like to see the society be in the future. I've been having some seminars with the German climate movement, who have been doing a lot of spectacular actions against art and gluing themselves to the highways and so on. And now they are starting to build a society that does not pollute and does not destroy the climate. So they're focusing much more energy and time on building a more healthy society. It doesn't get headlines, but they get more people to be part of it, and I think it's more effective in the long run.
Jürgen, out of our
I
land
really-
struggle, yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think we need to do both. We need to confront the bad systems
Absolutely.
and evil policies, but in addition, we need to prove that there is possibilities to live a different way. That goes for US against Trump, and that goes for the Indians against the fascist government you have in India,
Yes.
and it goes for all of us to start to be more concrete on the alternatives.
We have been developing, Stephen and Jürgen, Meta, a nonviolent economy concept. So after the struggle for land rights, we're encouraging people who do get land to start building economy. And I think the advantage in a country like India is still the community is not completely intact and divided by the caste system and many things, but still some sense of it is there. And when I come to Europe and Western Europe and North America, I always feel that building community is absolutely essential for resistance because you can't do it on your own. And certainly mass mobilization is a kind of a form of community building. But I think, as you say, Jürgen, you need to do the visualizing the future work and having positive, economic constructive work also as a goal, which helps to bring people together. And then they have the money and resources to fight against the forces that are oppressing.
Let me ask you about your concept of community, because I'm wondering whether you mean a neighborhood kind of thing. You organize people who are living close together and working close together, or you talk because I think there are plenty of communities in Western society, but they're not necessarily local or based on locality. There are NGO communities, there are church communities, there are all kinds of professional communities that I think are real, but they're not spatially concentrated. Are you talking about building neighborhoods?
I think we need all of it.
All of it, yeah.
How much you do it. It could be a networking online, it could be a local physical community, it could be on different kinds of alternatives. But start building, be very concrete on how you would like your grandchildren to live up in the future.
More intentional communities than just geographic. There has to be an intention or some sort of common goal to bring the community together. But sometimes that happens naturally geographically,
And community is important, and because if you work too much in isolation, burnout is quite common. And here in the United States, of course, where we are so hyper individualistic, I think it's one of the reasons we have such an incredibly low rate of unionization, of working people, and why it's been sometimes difficult to build a community. Of course, you don't want to go to the other extreme, where some communities get so inward focused, a lot of navel gazing, and a lot of so much obsession with the internal process that we lose sight of the wider struggle. But but I think that community is of critical importance. If I may just go back to what Jürgen was saying about a positive program and that kind of thing, I think it underscores the importance of nonviolent discipline. Not just because tactically, strategically, it's more useful just in terms of bringing down a regime or other kinds of social change. But it says a lot about what kind of future society you're going to have. The statistics show that autocratic regimes that are overthrown through nonviolent action, the vast majority, not all of them, the majority, become stable democracies within a few years. Whereas dictatorships overthrown by armed struggle almost always slide into a new dictatorship and or civil war. And the reasons are pretty obvious because in armed struggle, militaries are by their very nature hierarchical, and power comes from the barrel of the gun. and the commandante or whatever of the revolutionary movement then becomes the president, and that kind of leadership style remains. Whereas for a nonviolent movement to be successful, you need to build broad coalitions. It's a model, it's a more pluralistic model of give and take. And that, of course, serves well for what the post-revolutionary situation, ends up being. So I think when we look at a positive program, in addition to the economic and other things that we are envisioning to build a better society, we also need to think of how we conduct the struggle itself in terms of nonviolent commitment. And I would also just be aware about our own internal dynamics in terms of sexism and racism and classism and other forms of oppression. That we want to make sure we don't kind of perpetuate this thing. It's always white male leadership, or it's always the dominant groups. Again, if we're trying to build a new society, we want one that's truly inclusive.
That was also one of the conclusions by Gandhi in the 40s. He said civil obedience was important enough, but you should put more effort into the constructive program. Because as soon as the liberation came in India, they started going back to a very hierarchical society and big industries and focus on the money. It's quite embarrassing that the Indian money has a picture of Gandhi on them. He was really against that sort of economy. So we need to have alternatives in all different kinds of society. We need alternative farming, school system, transport system, and whatever. And we could start building them now. Maybe in a small scale, small islands of the future, and it could be in a big archipelago in the future. We could start to cooperate globally with these small islands.
I think economists have not really picked up on Gandhian economics. I don't know if you know J.C. Kumarappa. But he was really an economist that took Gandhi's ideas and put them into an economic frame. And ecological economists today say he made a lot of sense, and he wrote 100 years ago. So we're not really shining the light on local economic development, the theorizing of it, and creating a macro narrative which privileges a local economy. So we have a lot of work to do, don't we, in that department?
Absolutely. And also all the other parts of society. We need maybe different universities, maybe different transport systems, with different hospitals, medical systems. Because most of what we have today is part of the problem, basically. We need to have a very radical change on so many parts of our present societies.
I'm a little troubled by your approach, because it seems to me you're suggesting doing something that is going to take 50 years, 100 years if you're lucky. But we're in a situation now that I consider an emergency. I mean, people, and so we have to have tactics that are suited to the occasion and suited to the amount of danger that people actually are facing. And you have to understand that, obviously different countries, different regimes pose different threats to people. For example, people trying to do nonviolent resistance in Russia today have a whole different set of threats that they have to anticipate and work to overcome. And they certainly can't do things out in the open as much as somebody in Europe or even India now, or any place, even the U.S. But the U.S. itself is moving toward a place where people have to be extremely cautious about what they do. I mean, when they arrest people out on the street and start deporting them and sending them into what looks like concentration camps or something of that kind, it is a real threat that you can't ask people to take lightly. And when people's jobs are being, they're being dismissed, and the funding is cut for their research, if they're scientists, then we have to think of tactics that would be suitable for that kind of threat. And I don't know anybody in the world who has developed tactics for combating somebody who's funding is being cut. How do you fight that kind of thing? But I think we have to. So, I mean, the same with even demonstrations. Clearly, as Gene Sharp once explained to me, it didn't need to be explained, but that if there are times when you don't want to have a big demonstration because they might indeed shoot you. But so on a case like that, the thing to do is call a boycott or what Gandhi called a day of reflection and prayer, where people simply stay home massively throughout the country and demonstrate their opinions by not going onto the street where they might be in danger, etc. So I'm hoping that somebody will come up with some suggestions that might be useful for people who actually are finding their jobs in danger, or I've had some people that I would like to interview on my show who say, no, I'm a foreigner, I'm here on a green card, or I even don't have a green card, and I would be very likely to be sent home if I came out in public and talked about these things. So I think we have to look at, I'd like to look at what you do in what I consider an emergency, but not the kind of emergency that people have ever had to encounter before.
I take your point, Metta, and I think it's very important. But some of these problems are structural and will take time to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And if you focus more on the constructive part of resistance, you're not being confronted with the police in the same way. If you start home in your neighborhood, helping your neighbor producing food in the garden or out in the fields, that's not something the police will intervene in immediately. So many of these constructive techniques are not so dangerous for people to participate in. But we need all of it. We need both confrontations, and we need better systems to help people who are taken by the police and military and deported. But we also need to start growing what we would like to see in our own cities.
Jorgen, you'd agree there's a short term and a long term,
Yep.
here. And the long term is a vision of a better society that we all need to work for. But I think what Metta is quite right about is what can we do today for people who are facing the short term issues? Do you fellows have any suggestions on what, besides the structural changes, which are so important?
I don't have any easy solution, but we know that movements like ours have been confronting with that type of repression all over the world for the last 200 years.
Yeah.
It's nothing new. The new thing is that it's a Western democracy, so-called, who is taking the same methods against the own population. But that's been happening all over the place. Happening in China today, in India, in Cameroon, in Brazil, everywhere. So we could try to contact those who have been living under these conditions for the last 50 years and ask for help from them, get advice from them.
So a Marxist analysis would say that when there's enough grievances, there'll be a kind of a struggle that is created. Is that what we're expecting, that people will slowly experience more and more high standard of living, loss of job, no science, et cetera, no way to get reproductive rights? Is that what's going to slowly bring people together into some greater mass mobilization? Is that really what we think is going to happen?
I think that could be part of it. I mean, in Eastern Europe in the last 10 years, we've seen this right-wing populist governments reducing the freedom of speech, abortion rights, and so on, and criticizing the media, closing down the media. And that creates a new type of movement in Poland, in Hungary, there these days. We need to learn from them. But some people around the world have been facing that type of problem for 60, 70, 100 years. And let us look into what they've done to survive. And we don't have an easy solution now, but we need to start studying how they've been coping with it. That it is the first time for the middle class Western Europeans and North Americans facing these problems. It's nothing very unique. It's just that we have been avoiding those problems that have been difficult for other parts of the world.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
I just thinking that you have that reforms, even if it's simply saving democracy, may be urgent, but they need to be part a first step in a broader struggle. And I mentioned the example of Latin America. How they brought liberal democracy back, and then from there they can move on to make more radical changes. And very often in the course of a struggle, people may be initially motivated by a particular grievance, but then in the course of the struggle, they realize that the problem isn't just a couple bad leaders, but is indeed structural, and people get radicalized in a good sense of the word in the course of the movement. And just like we don't have to insist that everybody be a pacifist in order to take part in a nonviolent struggle. We don't necessarily somebody share a socialist vision or whatever the longer term structural changes we want to take part in the movement, but to still be willing to to ask the big questions, and to look at alternatives, and to promote that vision, keep the eyes on the prize, and to be able to build, on the one hand, a broad coalition of many of people with diverse opinions, but don't but realize that it is an ongoing struggle. It doesn't end with the more immediate goal.
No. And I think the solutions will be different depending on where you are. You don't have the same economical solution in Brazil that you have in Sweden. You need to have different kinds of economical systems to replace the present one. And the same with all the problems in our society. You can't just have one solution for the whole world.
I mean, we have been in a social movement for 25 years. I think it's 30 years, its anniversary. The last 11 years under the Modi government, we've lost almost all our political space. Yet we're readapting. It's very interesting to watch how that readaptation takes place because we keep going, but it is really tough. It's really tough. And the idea is basically you've got to find the mechanisms to still organize people in spite of the media being taken over, whatever. And so it's been an interesting, but I must say, it's as we developed our social movement over the last 30 years, the state developed its resistance to that, and undercutting it at every level. So you still have to try to keep one step ahead of that, but very tough. I mean, extremely tough.
Please take your lessons learned from India to Canada and to US. They need to learn how you've been able to cope with that horrible political system you had in India for 30 years. You should really try to take these lessons and adopt them to the North American context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, it seems to me that the problem now in the U.S. is how do you organize people who are really being threatened, either migrants who are being deported in large numbers, or people losing their jobs and that sort of thing. And the systems that have been used in the past to organize protests would be unions, would be especially political parties. Those are the main ones, but they're not effective now. The Democrats are completely, stymied and have no new ideas. There are nothing like unions that are effective. My notion is this is a time when you can still organize citizens' assemblies. And if we did that, if we encouraged people to innovate by creating citizens' assemblies where the people would be drawn by lottery the way juries are, so that they would be completely representative of their society. So far, nobody's trying to stomp those out. I think you could get away with creating citizens' assemblies and then give them the task of evaluating the moves that the governments are undertaking and create opposition through that mechanism. That'd be a totally new system, but maybe there are already existing organizations that would be equivalent or even better than that I'm not aware of. But I don't think that the structures that exist now that have been used in the past for organizing protests, I don't think that in the U.S. they're not able to do it right now.
We need many more experiments with different kinds of strategies and tactics. Test it out in a small scale, see if it works. If it works well, you should multiply it. If it doesn't work well, do something different. When the subtitle of the Gandhi autobiography was "My Experiments with Truth," he experimented all the time, and he failed quite often, but he learned from it.
Mm-hmm.
We should do the same. We should do experiments in our places of living, in our organizations, in our movements, because all these people who are now very angry at the Trump policy could be engaged if they had an option to do something different than what they're doing today.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that Gandhi didn't have was the social media, sort of reproducing actions every minute. And I think that throws a new challenge to leadership development, cadre building, because it's all happening in real time. And that doesn't allow people to have the time to create a culture of nonviolence or create some of that mobilization strategy. So I think, on the other hand, of course, social media can be very useful for organizing. Mm-hmm. So it can work the other way. But I think a lot of the leadership building is difficult because as soon as you get into the public arena, there's someone in the social media passing hate messages, So it's not easy. I think. What do you think about that?
On balance, social media can be a very positive thing, but I think we need to be really careful not to over rely on it or think, oh, Western technology saves the day, because movements find ways to communicate. I mean, for example, in Egypt, when the government ended up shutting down the internet and cell phone service, the movement actually grew dramatically over those next 4 days. People didn't trust the government media, so they went out to see for themselves and get swept up in the protest, or somebody looking for a concerned relative, because they couldn't contact them by phone, would go out to look for them and then get swept up in the protest. And one of my favorite examples of the way movements will use whatever media they can is in Mali and the pro-democracy movement back in 1991 against the Char regime. At that time, the majority of Malians were illiterate, and the government controlled the media, and of course it was before the internet or anything like that. And so the student activists in the city is trying to build support in the countryside. They utilize griots, the traditional singing storytellers, playing the kora, the mandinka harp, and they would tell these allegorical stories of struggles going back to the 12th century that mobilized people into the resistance. So people will use what they have, to communicate. And so obviously we need to use new technologies, to our benefit where we can, but not become overly dependent on them, especially since they can be jammed, they can be hijacked, they can be, in Sudan several years ago, there was an announcement for a big rally, pro-democracy rally at a certain place at a certain time. It was actually put out by the regime. So when people gathered, the police were there ready to round people up. Mm-hmm. The initial big march in Tahrir Square that really got things going in January of 2011. They ended up putting on social media, we're going to be at these 4 big places. We're going to march on the square. Whereas in reality, and they spread this through word of mouth, they are gathering at dozens of other places around and marching Tahrir Square through the narrow alleys where the tanks and the armored personnel carriers couldn't go. So we need to be innovative and not be overly reliant on social media or any particular way of communication.
I completely agree with you, Stephen. And please use these examples you mentioned now and all the other ones to tell people there are different ways of doing it. Inspire people to do it differently. And social media is very problematic. It's mainly used for surveillance these days.
My reason for worrying about social media is not, it's both. It is true that there's disinformation that goes on out there and you can't trust it anymore. You get messages that are flagrantly lies, but the equally serious but not as obvious effect is that the social media are controlled, they're privately owned, and they're controlled by billionaires who have no particular concern about our interests. And they can turn people off. So I'm in touch with people who are actually finding their access rejected, and they're losing control of their own networks of communication in the social media. That's not happening on a big scale, thank God, but it's serious because the people I'm talking about are people who have a lot of influence. One guy has 300,000 followers, and he's having a lot of trouble with YouTube that just try to give him trouble. And he wonders who his enemy is. He doesn't even know who is in the organization is trying to screw him over, but somebody is. And that's the problem. You're powerless,
I was in a conference a couple of years ago about democracy and surveillance. And one of the participants were a secret agent in the 80s who were spying on me when I was an activist. And I asked him, how should we communicate without being detected by the police today? He said, send a postcard. No one reads it anymore. You don't even need... you don't even need to use an envelope. No one in police reads postcards anymore. The most system to communicate these days.
Well, one area where social media can make a positive difference is exposing abuses, by authorities. That was a key issue in Egypt. It was, and for the reasons I mentioned, they downplay the role of social media in the revolution itself, but the consciousness being raised about abuses in police and the like did come through people on social media sharing films of police abuses, of giving the names and details of there's the website that a female journalist made called Pigopedia, which exposed the abuses by police and the like, and so it can be useful sort of in consciousness raising and that kind of thing. But again, I for all the reasons we've mentioned so far, I'd be cautious about over relying it for the revolutionary struggle itself.
I also heard about an example from a movement that had been facing serious problems with infiltrators, the police infiltrator movement, and they're starting to use face recognition of everyone in the group, and they could find the photos of the policemen as part of the group. That's a high-tech way to identify infiltrators today. And very, very, very excellent programs doing that, face recognition.
Well, as somebody, this Tofekci lady who writes for the New York Times, I think her full name, she's Turkish or something, but she's a sociologist, and she pointed out that although the Tahrir Square demonstrators were very successful in bringing together mass crowds, but they did this using I think it was Twitter primarily. Everybody had Twitter in those days, but the problem is afterwards, when you need to organize your movement and know who's going to become the new minister of education or whatever, who's going to take what roles in this new government, they weren't ready because they were able to bring people out. They say, be at 6 o'clock in Tahrir Square or wherever we tell you to go, and that people would come. But they didn't get acquainted and they didn't build a movement. So only by working together in an organization over a period of time do you get the sense that such and such a person, that he'd be a good person for this committee or this department in the new government you're going to form. And that person is somebody who's a sweet person, but not the right person for that job, and so on. You have to know each other and work together for a while to get that kind of awareness that you really need. And that's why she said they weren't able to build a government to take over when, the government, the Egyptian government just said, here are the keys, you take over. And then nobody was ready.
It was the same in Eastern Germany. When the wall fell down, the opposition were not prepared at all to take over. And they were completely co-opted by the Western Germany government and CIA to take over the system. So we are not prepared when we have these possible victories ahead of us. We need to be better prepared for the long term as well as the short term emergencies.
Well, it works the other way too. I mean, in the anti-corruption movement in India, we thought we were all fighting corruption, but it brought in the BJP government. So, it can also work in the other direction.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, nobody has so far proposed any new structural innovations. And I think that is probably what's required, given the fact that we say, be careful about using social media, that you're vulnerable there, even though certainly use it when you can, but watch out that you have a backup plan. And clearly the Democrats don't know what they're doing. What resistance can we put together that has any hope? I think part of the problem is that globally, this whole right-wing movement is it springs up here, there, and everywhere. It's all over the place, but there is no coherent center of gravity for opposition or a counter movement, a movement that you and I and most of our friends would gladly support. And I'd like to see the elders come forward as positioning themselves to be the counterpart to, let's say, to Trump. Globally, we need somebody who's not Putin, not Xi, not Trump, but who is standing for reasonable democratic principles. And I think that if they had a location where they could, something be equivalent to having the Kremlin or having the Vatican or having the White House or having a base someplace. And I would think that a university like Harvard might say, well, here we have some empty buildings. You can have a space here, and we'll create a coalition between Harvard University and the elders, and we will now then be the spokesperson for the alternative views.
I think one problem, the reason we've had a rise of this right-wing populism is that I think a lot of more progressive people among the political elites, at least, don't seem to realize that the best antidote to right-wing populism is left-wing populism. A neoliberal centrism doesn't do it. And we have seen in so many areas, people, working class people used to vote for left parties who are now voting for the far right parties because the left parties are no longer particularly left. They are, they have been, again, they've become part of the neoliberal consensus. And I think that's where, popular social movements can come in, and that we need to force the opposition to, take more progressive populist positions and win back the working class. And what I've seen in my research of movements against authoritarianism is that the successful ones tend to be able to get the more radical grassroots activism, the bottom-up, activists, the more direct action-focused people, and the opposition of political leaders to work together. But the problem is, of course, is that a lot of the opposition political leaders are scared of their base, are scared, who disrespect and don't like the grassroots movement. And of course, those of us who are more in the grassroots movement, we have our plenty good reasons to not like and distrust the traditional opposition parties. So there needs to be some kind of bringing together that you can have elite politicians and elite institutions like the universities and others be willing and able to push and to work with those of us who may have a more radical vision. And I think those of us who've been around a lot and have actually been part of social movements and have studied social movements have have a lot to contribute, while of course respecting the energy and innovations of younger activists. But I think that the key is to build, really is to remind people the importance to build a broad coalition where we don't compromise our longer term radical vision, but we are willing to work with those to simply save democracy, and recognize that pushing them to move to the left is not just because we want them to agree with us more, but that is actually a more winning strategy, because that is going to win back those who have fallen prey to the mirage, to the lies of the far right.
Well, that's a really important debate that goes on in the U.S. now, is whether the Democrats would be smart to try to be more centrist, or with AOC and Bernie Sanders and I don't know how many others. There are not many.
Donald Mondavi, he just won the Democratic primary for New York City mayor.
Yes. Well, I think that's an interesting question. To me, I'm not sure which way is the most promising.
I'm not quite convinced that the state level is the most interesting one. Some of the serious problems we are facing are not limited to the states, like the climate problems, the economical systems. They are globally. So I think if you focus too much on the state level and take the fight there, we might be failing in the long run. I would like to skip the state level and focus locally and globally.
Okay, well then react to my crazy proposal about the elders in Harvard University.
Absolutely. Please go on.
Okay.
Start it. Absolutely. I would like to have thousands of examples, testing it out, see if it functions, and celebrate victories, and lick your wounds, and then go on with different things if you fail.
All right.
That goes for local communities, for the national level, for the regional level, in the cities, on the countryside. Test out new ways of organizing and mobilizing and building new societies.
Well, you get to do that for me. I'm sort of housebound. I'm not going out in the boonies to do organizing, but you guys.
But you have some neighbors. Organize them.
Stephen, how about organizing California? You've got some potential there, don't you?
Yes, but yeah, I think the exciting work actually is being done more in the grassroots, among the non-white majority in the state. I think I'm not. I think frankly, I'm a better intellectual than I am an organizer, to be honest. And I think certainly where some of my research can be of relevant use. I hope people can use them, but I'm not confident of my own organizing skills to do much.
Who in California could be an organizer? Newsom. What's going to happen there?
No, yeah, I don't think sort of the neoliberal, mainstream Democrats are going to lead the resistance. But I think about. But if you look at almost any movement, and I know U.S. history the most, but I'm sure those of you can think of history in your own countries and countries you've lived in, countries you've studied, is that if the people lead, the leaders will follow. I mean, we saw how during the anti-Vietnam War struggle that we had virtually no allies in Congress initially back in 1964 or 65. But by moratorium day 1969, suddenly all the Democrats were claiming that they were anti-war and had been for a long time, and that kind of thing. So it's less in certain ways, it's less important who we get elected as the choices that we give them. And I think we need to have a mass movement that the people that those in power cannot cannot ignore.
Well, I think the Californians are the most promising group of people ideologically to form a coherent movement that is, I don't know, I would call it a leftist community. Wouldn't you?
I mean, I think there's certainly really good. It depends on how you identify left. I mean, again, the establishment politicians are more liberal than left, but I do think that there is a greater potential, and we certainly do have some elected officials on the a number of members of the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as a number of people in state and state assembly, and that who are genuine leftist. But I think that we really need to make clear that given we have this two-party duopoly in the United States, so that the Democratic Party does move to the left. But again, that's only if there is a vibrant grassroots community that they can no longer ignore.
Okay, but I mean, Trump is trying to remove all of the conditions that the Californians placed on, for example, cars and automobile emissions, and what kinds of climate change issues, and as well as he's going to cut the funding for the university system and the research there and so on. That's where I think all the Californians would line up in opposition to.
Yes, definitely. That's been a good sign. There's been the level of resistance that we've seen.
But there's no mechanism for articulating their demands. And that's what I'm thinking. What can we do? Okay. All we have to do is now think of how to make it all work. So it's been fun, and carry on with the wonderful things that you have been doing. Appreciate it. And see you again soon. Okay?
Thank you, Meta.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meta.